Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here to visit. I'm going to talk today about a very complicated issue. I don't pretend to have it all figured out, and I definitely would welcome any comments or input. Why I'm talking about this is I've had the opportunity for the last 5 years to serve on the Scientific Advisory Committee for the International Congress on Biological Invasions. Long title to mean that I contribute to a group concerned with invasive species. It is. And when we met for our inaugural meeting in China back in 2007, we were all assigned a responsibility, an area of responsibility. And the one I was assigned was the impact that invasives have on human well-being. And so what you're going to see here is, in essence, a presentation of what will be the final report when I get it actually completed. The final report for that group, and looking at just one aspect. There are many ways that invasives impact human well-being. I'm only going to talk today about food security. So again, definitely welcome all the input. But I'm going to start with a disclaimer. The subject of today's presentation is more complex than I will present, and less certain than I will suggest. However, I believe that the basic premise is correct. Scientists are very good at overstating issues, and our track record for predicting the future is not very impressive. Consequently, I will most likely overstate some issues, and the predictions that I make are unlikely to be fully realized. Having said that, I stand by the analysis. Okay. Well, certainly those in plant pathology, but most of us in agriculture are aware of the history of pests and pathogens on food security. A classic one we learn about in many introductory courses was the Irish potato famine. So in Northern Europe, there was an outbreak back in the 1840s, and between 1845 and 47, it was particularly harsh in Ireland, resulting in the death of 1 million people from either direct starvation or hunger-related illnesses, and the ultimate emigration of at least 1 million more, many who came to this country. Fast forward a century, in 1943, the Bengal rice famine, where 3 million people died of hunger, starvation, or hunger-related illnesses. Now that's more deaths than resulted from combat in World War I and World War II combined. It's a big number. Currently, we're looking at a lot of issues around the world. One is in Central Africa, where many populations rely on bananas and plantains for up to 70% of their caloric intake. And there are 3 diseases currently now threatening banana and plantain production in this region. So we'll see how this unfolds. Why should the U.S. care about this issue? Why should Minnesota care about this issue? Well, if we look at our economy and the value of crops sold, if you just take the top 9 states in the U.S., you see, I care because I live in Kansas, but you should care because Minnesota is in the top 9 states for total production. If we look at the top commodities, grains and oilseeds, number 1, cattle and calves, number 2, those 2 commodities are almost 50% of that value. So let's look at the top 10 states for all ag exports, and you see that Minnesota is in the top 10. If we look at the top 10 states for feed and fodder, you see that Minnesota is in the top 10. And if you look at the top 10 for wheat exports, you see that Minnesota is in the top 10. We are fortunate in the world to have nations that can produce more food than they need to supply those nations that don't have that capacity. And we either do that directly through export, or we provide grains and staple crops into food reserves that can be drawn upon in times of need. The United States is a major player in food aid and food trade. And the Great Plains and Midwest regions of the United States are major players in the United States. So this matters here. And what happens here has ripple effects throughout the United States economy and food security worldwide. That's a fact of life. What is food security? Well, it's defined differently depending upon which agency is doing the analysis. The World Bank says it's access by all people at all times to enough food for an active, healthy life. FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, says it's all people at all times have both physical and economic access to the basic food they need. And USAID, Agency for International Development, says when all people at all times have access to sufficient food to meet their dietary needs for a productive and healthy life. So these definitions have evolved over time since they were first incorporated into policy making in the early 1980s. And they'll continue to change as we learn more about the components of food security and the relationships between those components. If we look at the major challenges we're facing this century, energy, water, food, climate change, and public health, for each one of these, plant systems contribute to both the problems and the solutions. There's a very interesting publication called The Politics of Plants by Frau et al., 2009, in the journal Food Security, the first issue. And it talks about how plant systems and plant products are being used politically. Very few would argue that plant biosecurity is prerequisite to sustainability. You cannot achieve sustainability in any society unless plant systems are healthy. During the course of this presentation, so let's assume that we end up spending about an hour here. While we are sitting here, we will add 24,000 people to our planet. And in that same period of time, over 2,000 people will die of hunger-related illnesses. Each day, we add approximately 250,000 people to our planet. So for us in Kansas, right next door is Missouri, that's the equivalent of every 2 days we're adding another Kansas City to the planet. In that same day, over 23,000 people will die of hunger-related illnesses. This is happening every day. We are currently at 6.9 billion people, projected to reach 7 billion sometime between July and October of this year. Most of the models that evaluate this say we will reach 9 billion between 2043 and 2050. So that means that over the next few decades, we will add 30% more people to the planet than we have today. Well, how are we doing now with 6.9 billion people? Over 1 billion people live on lands that exceed the carrying capacity, meaning that there are more people per unit area than that land can actually support. 1/3 of the world's population lives in poverty. 850 million people went without food in 2007. And 100 million people live in imminent danger of starvation. In the 1980s, there were approximately 15 food emergencies each year. Between 2000 and 2010, there were between 30 food emergencies per year. Between 1985 and 2005, there were food emergencies in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, South America, and Central America. This is global. In 2010, 93 million people in 70 countries required food aid for survival. Those statistics come from the World Food Program. So, how are we doing now with 6.9 billion people? Not particularly well. There's a significant discussion going on globally right now as to whether food security is a basic human right. I ask you to think about that. I'm not going to deal with this anymore. This is a very big issue. It's a serious controversy. Not my generation. The young folks in here, your generation is going to have to deal with this. UN Millennium Development Goals. So, in 2000, 189 nations signed a UN declaration to eradicate extreme poverty. At that time, it was those living on less than 50 cents a day. That has been up to about $1.25 a day now. To alleviate extreme hunger, those surviving on less than 1,600 calories a day. To improve public health and nutrition, and do all of this while ensuring environmental sustainability, whatever that actually means. A year later, Food and Agriculture Organization issued a report on the state of food and agriculture. In it, they said, hunger and malnutrition act as an impediment to economic growth and welfare improvement. Well, how does that fit into the food security equation? Well, there's what's called the poverty cycle. People who are hungry become malnourished. And the malnourished earn less and drop into poverty. Those in poverty cannot afford to purchase food and become further malnourished. So we need to eradicate hunger in order to alleviate poverty, but we need to eradicate poverty in order to alleviate hunger. This is a conundrum that is very difficult to break into in some areas of the world. Current state of the world, in 2005, 36 million more people in extreme poverty than in 1990. 2008, 21% of the world's workers lived on less than $1.25 a day. In 2009, 1.4 billion people lived in extreme poverty. If we look at how we spend our money on food, we're going to look at that in low-income, middle-income, and high-income countries. We see that, and these are averages, so there's a pretty big spread around these means. For low-income countries, they average about $250 a year on food. In middle-income countries, it's about $800 a year on food, and in high-income and wealthy countries like the United States and many European countries, we spend approximately $2,200 a year on food. Now, again, pretty big spread around those means, but they're useful means for evaluating some of these problems. So, those are the actual numbers, but there's what's called Engel's law, and that is what's more important is not the actual number, but what proportion that represents of the total. So in low-income countries, that $250 represents 45% of their income. And in middle-income countries, 27%, in high-income countries, only 11%. In the United States, currently, the number is at approximately 9%. So we spend about 9% of our income on food, which allows us about 90% of our income to spend on the goods and services associated with a high standard of living. That's why we all have cell phones. That's why we drive cars, and individual home ownership is so high in this country. Because we only spend about 10% on one of the two things you absolutely cannot do without: food and water. As incomes rise, people buy more food, but importantly, they buy different foods. More fruits and vegetables, but most importantly, there's a shift from plants to meat as a primary source of protein. Why is that so important? Well, as incomes rise and we shift to animals as a primary protein source, it takes 3 times as much plant material if you're going to pass it through an animal in order to satisfy the human requirement for protein. In between 85 and 95, the rise in standard of living in Taiwan resulted in a 65% increase in meat production. If you think about trying to meet our basic needs, we're not just trying to achieve food security, we're trying to raise standards of living. So as we do this, it's going to require a lot more food. So what's happening then, as the population increases, there's a disproportionate increase in the food demand. A 30% increase in the global population may very well require 70 to 100% more food than we're currently producing. Now, these are top estimates that I've seen in 3 or 4 publications. I've run numbers myself using different analyses, and for me, best case scenario comes out at if we add 30% more people, it's going to require 55% more food than we're currently producing. Happy to talk to anybody about those numbers later. So again, if we look at how we spend our income on food, in North America it's 9 to 11%, in Latin America it's 47 to 72%, in Asia 52 to 75%, and in Africa 67 to 86% of their income is spent on food. And the so what of that is this: when food is 10% of your income, a 50% increase makes it 15% of your income, you adjust. But when food is 80% of your income, a 50% increase makes it 120% of your income, and you can no longer afford food. We have some issues to address globally. Food for commerce versus food for consumption. Crops for food versus crops for fuel. These issues have both local and global ramifications. Hunger and poverty. We've seen production shifts for staple foods. Cereals for food increased 4% since 2000. Cereals for feed, that which we provide to the animals, has increased 7% since 2000. And I have a virus. Not me personally. But cereals for fuel increased 25% since 2000, which means we're changing the way we think about the crops we produce and how we might use them. And these changes in our thinking will have significant impact upon achieving our food security objectives. If we look at the increased cost for staples, cereal prices increased 50% between 2000 and 2006, and then they doubled between 2006 and 2008 using the 2000 base price. Poverty and hunger. Adults who are malnourished as children are less productive physically and intellectually. Lots of data on that. Low educational achievement. Higher levels of chronic illness and disability. Again, lots of data on that. Undernourished people. In 1990, 21% of the population was considered undernourished. In 2004, that dropped to 17%. In 2009, it dropped to 15%. So this is a good trend. It looks like we're starting to get a handle on this battle with undernourished people. However, if we look at the actual number of people affected, in 1990, 21% of the population represented 842 million people. 2004, 17% represented 873 million. And in 2009, 15% of the population represented over 1 billion people. So although we're winning the war with percentages, we're losing the war with actual numbers. Why plant biosecurity? That was in the title. Why? Just 4 plant species provide 59% of the calories that feed the world. Rice, wheat, potato, maize. Wheat's bolded. It's not from Kansas or the wheat state. Plant health is the foundation for human health. And I'm happy to argue that with anybody at any point in time. You cannot meet our human health objectives, our public health objectives, if you do not satisfy the plant health objectives. Can't be done. Plant biosecurity is essential to food security, and food security is essential to national security. UN World Food Program said hunger is tied to civil unrest. When people get hungry enough, they move. And populations on the move are prone to conflict. What do these nations have in common? Food riots and protests in 2008 as a result of the high prices of wheat, rice, and palm oil, resulting in food shortages. At least 30 nations experienced civil unrest that led to the overthrow of the government in Haiti and serious protests in Pakistan, Kenya, and Argentina. Some of that discord is still in existence. What we've seen towards the end of 2010 and now into 2011 is a repeat of this. Projections are that this will be repeated between 2011 and 2012. We will see at least the same number of riots, if not more, over this next year that we saw in 2008. And there are several governments that are on the verge. Everybody's been paying attention to the news. We're paying attention to what's going on right now in Northern Africa and what happened in Egypt. Now, is food why Egypt revolted? No, they had some massive social problems. But food was the proverbial last straw. It was a food riot that instigated the first line of protests in Egypt that led to the overthrow of that government. We're seeing that played out, and projections are this is going to continue over the next year until we get a grip on it. What were the response in 2008? Well, there were price freezes on staple foods in Southeast Asia and in Russia. We saw banned rice exports in Southeast Asia and India. We saw increased people on food aid. Some of the government stepped in and increased the number of people eligible for food aid in order to suppress the riots. And then in Yemen, prices of staples doubled in 4 months, resulting in riots that killed many. We now have some experience with this. And again, the projections are over the next year, 18 months, we're going to see this again. So let's go back to our model. We can produce enough food and get it to where it's needed. We're not doing a particularly good job of that. What happened in 2008 with the rising prices is it resulted in surplus nations putting an embargo. They were afraid they might run out of food locally, domestically, so they stopped exporting. Stopped exporting and stopped putting grain into the stores. Well, that induced panic buying in the food deficit nations who were afraid maybe 6 months from now, I'm not going to be able to get enough food. So they started buying as much as they could, as quickly as possible. What that did was put a major drain on our global food reserves. They ended up at the end of 2008 at 30 and 40-year lows. Why was that? The drivers were high oil prices and the weak US dollar, export restrictions, panic buying, changing diets in China and India. We talked about that a little bit before. As the incomes rise in these countries, you're seeing major changes in the diet, increased consumption of meats, which puts an increased demand on grain for feed. And then the biofuel conversions. Now this is a bit of a controversy. Lots of arguments about just what level of impact that had, how much it contributed, but some are suggesting that if you look at the data for the US where, and I forget which year, so sometime between 2008 and 2010, so it was one of those years, 8, 9, or 10, the percentage of increase in grain production in the United States, at least 1/3 went to fuels that could have been going into grain reserves. And so there's an argument over that, but whether it's 30% or whether it's 25% or 20%, the point is our changing perception of how to use plants is affecting the food security equation. So let's go back to our goals. We're trying to eradicate poverty, alleviate hunger, and we're trying to improve public health and nutrition. What do we do? Well, to achieve the Millennium Development Goals, the FAO said we need to reform the process underway to ensure their successful integration into global agricultural markets. There, in this case, means developing nations. So the solution is to pull these emerging economies into the global marketplace as quickly as possible so that we can raise their earning potential so they can buy food on the open market. G8, G20, World Trade Organization, and a few others agreed. We need to reject protectionism and encourage the development of local, regional, and internationally integrated agricultural markets. Again, the solution to food insecurity is increased trade. Well, we have free trade agreements. Lots of regional ones. There's more than this, but a lot of regional. These are bilateral agreements that the U.S. has. Clearly, what you can see is we trade with everybody. We trade all over the world, Africa, Asia, Australia, Europe, North America. We're trading everywhere. Stuff's coming in and out of the United States at amazing rates. Increased numbers of free trade agreements. My caution is this. Free trade is not free. Go back to that FAO report in 2001. The effects of globalization can be unpredictable. Among the effects is the ease with which plant pests are spread. And plant pests are a permanent threat to crop and livestock producers. Now, the threat to crops is rather straightforward. Why is it a threat to livestock producers? Let me use the Kansas example. Our two biggest industries are wheat and cattle. And the reason is transportation is all about weight. And it's much less expensive to ship an 800-pound animal into Kansas than it is to ship 2 tons of grain to Georgia. So because we produce a lot of high-quality, low-cost grain, we import a lot of animals to come in, get fattened up before they go to the slaughterhouse. So the two systems, the plant and the animal production systems in the Great Plains, are highly integrated. They're mutually dependent. If the cattle industry went away, we wouldn't need as much crop production. If crop production failed, the animal systems have a problem with feed. So these are very interdependent systems. We know that when we move plants and plant products around, and we do a lot of it, you can't help but also move pests, pathogens, and invasive plants. Part of the package. This is from the Port of Miami. I had the good fortune to spend a couple days with the Customs and Border Protection people there. If you ever get that opportunity, I just highly encourage it. It's an experience you can't possibly imagine. The volume of materials coming into this country is staggering. Where's it coming from? It's coming from all over the place. In 2007, the U.S. imported over 48 million metric tons of agricultural products worth over $80 billion. Now, we only inspect 1 to 2% of that. It's too much. You can't look at any more than 1 to 2%. And I did a calculation with just pork crops. So these are just plants and cut flowers coming into the United States. And again, think about it. We want poinsettias at Christmas. We want roses at Valentine's Day. We want tulips and lilies at Easter. We're pretty particular. These are highly sophisticated industries, the hort industry. But we don't produce much of that in this country. Most of that's produced offshore, and we import it. And I did a calculation from just the stuff coming in at the airport at Miami. And the average inspection, now remember, we're only inspecting 1 to 2%, but the average inspection is 6.7 seconds. How much can you see in 6.7 seconds? In 2007, then, we imported over 47 million metric tons of agricultural products uninspected. We didn't even look at it. Say, well, okay, still so what? Well, so what's this? With that 1 to 2% we're inspecting, we're pulling out 12 to 14,000 pests and pathogens annually. So we know stuff's getting in. It's coming by air, it's coming by sea. It does go through an inspection. But right outside the inspection station, waiting to be cleared, is a long line of trucks that are going to get packed up with these fruits and plant products and right out to retail centers across the U.S. They are inspected. People are looking and packing materials, they're looking in the products themselves. But again, the volumes are so significant that time is small. So here's one of my favorite examples. Citrus. We have become accustomed to having whatever we want, whenever we want it. I think the statistic is that 80-some-odd% of the population of the United States lives within 15 miles of a Walmart that sells food 24/7. So you can get whatever you want, whenever you want it. But citrus is only in season about 5 months of the year in the United States. And I want citrus every day. So we import citrus from Southeast Asia, from Chile, Argentina, from the Mediterranean. We import from all over the place. Now, when you bring that home from the supermarket and you leave it on a counter too long or you leave it in the refrigerator too long, what happens? Out come my favorite organisms, decay organisms. Okay? And what do you do here in Minnesota with that fruit? I'm fairly certain, I know. You all bring that to your local county extension agent, who puts it in an autoclave bag and brings it to Dimitri, because he knows what to do with it. He seals that bag and autoclaves it. Right? I mean, that's what we do in Kansas. No, you throw it away. Every single day of the year, we are intentionally introducing exotic pathogens and pests into our environment. It's the fruit. The pathogens came from Chile. They came from Thailand. They came from Turkey. They came from all over the place. Any of you have ever been to a youth sporting event? What's left behind when the games are done and the kids are gone? Fruit. Because they leave the fruit behind, they ate the candies. And then you'll see bananas, you'll see oranges, you'll see apples all over the place. Every day of the year, we're intentionally introducing exotic pests into our environment. This week, there will be 6 million cargo containers on ships in transit, somewhere in the ocean. And this week, 192 of those containers are going to fall off the ship. Some of them will sink, some of them will wash up on a shore somewhere and spew their contents. That equates to 10,000 cargo containers lost at sea each year. Invasive species this week will cost $1.7 billion globally. These are conservative estimates. So what's the impact here? Well, some estimates are that invasive species cost the United States about $130 billion a year. And USDA APHIS is using this figure as well. And I don't know how you get a solid fix on this because a lot of these are indirect costs. But most people are accepting this as a reasonable figure. How does that translate to us? Well, that's $422 per person. Not everybody pays taxes, so if you look at just taxpayers, that means each one of you that paid taxes last year, $1,200 of that went to manage invasive species. I guarantee that number's going up over the next 10 to 15 years. In 2009, through the Port of Miami, we imported 1.2 billion live plants. That's just the Port of Miami. We imported 2.6 million pounds of seed for planting. This is seed raised in another country on another continent that we're importing into the United States to take out and plant. We intercepted over 40,000 potential invasives, and only about 2,700 were actually identified. Again, we're only looking at about 1 to 2%. Trade across our borders. More produce crosses the Nogales Bridge in Arizona than any other bridge in the world. That one bridge. 2,000 trucks a day, carrying about $20 million of business every day. Trade over the Detroit-Windsor Bridge, that one bridge, exceeds all our exports to Japan. I'm trying to impress you with the numbers. They're big. In 2007, the U.S. imported $500 billion worth of products from 12 Western Hemisphere nations. $6 billion were directly agricultural. But you know, it's not just the plants and plant products, if I haven't made this point. It's packing materials, too. A colleague of mine at APHIS, PPQ, Matt Royer, gave me these data. He said between 06 and 08, they were finding one new exotic pest every 8 to 12 days in the United States. And we're not looking, by the way. What do these nations have in common? In the 1 month of September 2009, USDA's Peril Group in North Carolina were developing pest risk assessments to import 37 species of fruits and vegetables from 69 nations on 6 continents. That's just that 1 month. We're moving a lot of product into this country. But that's not enough. In his State of the Union address in January 2010, President Obama said, so tonight, we set a new goal. We will double exports over the next 5 years. I heard him say that. I was a little alarmed, so I went and got the transcript just to make sure I heard it right. This is correct. He further said, we are launching a national export initiative to help farmers and small businesses increase their exports and reform export controls. Translate reform export controls, it means we will reduce our standards. Aaron Cosby, International Institute for Sustainable Development in Switzerland, said, our leaders are hoping that trade will kickstart the economic recovery. Nobody thinks this can possibly happen without some serious concessions, at least to the major developing country exporters. It's not just the United States that's doing this, everybody's doing this. If we look at exports on a global scale, this is between 2000 and 2009, that solid line is the mean for world trade. That upper line are emerging economies. You can see that they're developing at an annualized growth rate of 39%, way outpacing the rest of the world, which means for exports, they're putting more stuff out of their countries into the global marketplace, a lot of it. Let's look at imports. Same basic trend. So stuff's going in and out of these emerging economies. Consultative Group on International Ag Research, that's the organization that manages, monitors the International Research Center. Developing countries are least equipped to deal with a new invasive species threat in agriculture. Increasing trade has put a strain on those systems. So the nations that are least equipped to deal with increased trades are the ones we're encouraging to trade the most. Pest introduction through aid program, it's not just trade. It's food aid. When we send food to another country, it's not magically free of pests, pathogens, and invasive plants. It has those as well. So there's a long history of us introducing a variety of organisms into developing countries with the aid, the food aid that we ship to them, which, of course, undermines their ability to ultimately produce enough to sustain their own population. There have been reports, this is a quote from the World Trade Organization, March 2010. There have been reports of stricter application of SPS, sanitary and phytosanitary, regulations in some G20 markets. This kind of trade obstacle is not easy to substantiate. The World Trade Organization, and it looks like a typo with obstacles, it should be obstacle, that's verbatim out of their report. They look at phytosanitary regulations as an obstacle to trade that needs to be dealt with. And they're trying to lower the standards globally. One thing that you need to understand about trade rules is that trade rules. Every case that we can come up with, trade will win over a decision about an invasive. The World Trade Organization considers phytosanitary regulations an obstacle, and that's a problem for plant health. Now, global trade is not new. This is not a new concept. We've had at least 3,000 years of international trade. But what is new is the magnitude of trade in plants and plant products and the speed at which they move around the world. So if we look at 1796, it took 3 weeks by horse and carriage to move something from Philadelphia to West Virginia. A century later, it took 8 days by rail to go from one coast to the next. But now we can harvest, inspect, pack, ship to the U.S., then inspect, ship to retail centers, plants in 48 to 72 hours. Which, of course, is much shorter than the latent period for most of the organisms we're concerned with. If you think about the inspection process, it's based on symptoms. We're not going to see them in that time period. It's not just about global trade. We're doing this domestically, too. The example everybody's familiar with, Phytophthora ramorum, I would imagine. It was found, so it occurs in north central California and part of Oregon in natural plant systems. But it was detected in a nursery in Southern California in 2004, but not before that nursery had shipped plants to over 40 states. And the outcome was infected plants were recovered and destroyed at 172 sites in 22 states. Most were commercial nurseries, so that was a good thing. They got them before they were planted into the landscape, but 3 were at residential sites, but they actually were able to track it that far. So we probably have introduced this organism around. The concern is that P. ramorum is readily disseminated in asymptomatic plants. So when they went and did their inspections, they only destroyed the ones that were showing symptoms. And then current inspection protocols are not adequate. Well, fast forward to 2010. Lo and behold, it was found in a nursery in Oregon, but not before that nursery shipped to 35 states. And the way this played out was, it was detected at the nursery in May, and so lots of conference calls and drawing everybody in, figure out what to do, how to respond. We came up with a plan, we did a survey. But during this period, we learned that those plants were shipped the previous December. So most of those plants were probably already sold to homeowners and put out in the landscape. We have International Plant Protection Convention, 177 signatory nations. Policy is required by the convention to be science-based. The problem is the science is imperfect. We all know that. And the policy says we cannot regulate unknowns. But what we know from our experience is that the unknowns are the biggest threat. Challenges. Consequences of global trade are not always predictable. Council for Ag Science and Technology did a study in 2001 that said our ability to predict invasives is only about 30%. And they did an analysis of the previous 50 years or 70 years. of all the invasives. We said at that point in time, we were only right 30% of the time. What are some of the consequences, the unintended, the things you can't see? Well, we have two pathogens, Phytophthora candidura, Phytophthora fragaria. One's a pathogen of oak, beech, and chestnut. The other's a pathogen of strawberry and raspberry. They're separate species, obviously in different plant systems. However, we learned that they can hybridize. And these hybrids are not pathogenic to the host species that the parents are. They're in fact pathogenic, aggressively so, to species that the parents are not. So the bottom line here is the interspecies hybrid have a unique phenotype not predicted by the parental phenotypes. It's more aggressive and has a new host range. That should alarm us. Our pest risk assessments are based on what's known, and what's known in a certain location. This wouldn't even qualify. So one example that people are looking at, these different scenarios, models are that you have two species. You remove the geographic barrier by putting it on an airplane and shipping it to a location. You're going to get a hybrid, and then that hybrid is going to have an unpredictable phenotype. And there'd be no PRA that could possibly address this. It's not just fungi, that's just oomycetes. The same thing's happening with viruses, and I don't have time to discuss that. But it's not an isolated case. This hybridization is occurring repeatedly. So we go back to challenges. They're not just the direct effects, and they're not just effects on plant systems. So I'm going to give you a case here now of the movement of plants and plant products having an impact on human health or potential impact. Ornamental bamboo plants, big industry, and China ships to the Netherlands 1 cargo container a week containing 1 million plants. What was found a couple years ago that's on those bamboo shoots was Aedes albopictus, the Asian tiger mosquito. The so what of that is that it's a very efficient vector of human viruses. And it vectors dengue virus, chikungunya virus, and chikungunya virus is not a lethal virus, but it causes a really bad flu. People get sick for weeks and weeks and weeks. It drags on, and they're unable to work. It's a debilitating type of flu. Ultimately recover, but it's pretty significant. So what might happen, because this introduction to the Netherlands just happened within the last couple of years, what could happen? Well, let's look at another case. Recycling is good for the planet. So we recycle used automobile tires. We're so good at it here in the United States that we take used tires from other countries. So we imported used tires from Japan in 1985, but in the tires was water, and in the water was larvae of Aedes albopictus, the Asian tiger mosquito. And it got established in Houston and then spread, and it is now present in 26 states. We have this now in Kansas, and it's unpleasant. It's unpleasant because it's an aggressive biter and it feeds during the day. If you think about transmission of human viruses, that's a big deal. Well, we're a good neighbor of the world, good citizen of the world, so sometimes when we get overloaded, we send our used tires elsewhere. So we did that. We sent them in 1992 to Italy, but of course in the tire was water, and the water were larvae of the Asian tiger mosquito. And it got established in Italy and spread and became very well adapted to that part of Italy. In 2007, vacationers went to Reunion Island, returned home, but when they returned home, they were infected with the chikungunya virus. Now, when they got home, they were going home to a site that had a really good vector for this virus. And it had an outbreak, and the outbreak spread. And the consequences were this. Thousands of Italians became ill. Blood donations were restricted. It's a new disease, new pathogen. Can't donate blood. You can't donate organs. Serious public health implications from this. There were shortages for surgeons. There are likely to be a lot of these scenarios that we're just catching up with. The consequences are not always obvious or intuitive, but here's one of my favorites. Electric guitars. They're produced in China quite a bit, and Australia imports them from China. But last year. Late 2009, one of the inspectors, quality control inspector, was looking at the guitars and he noticed they must have drilled an extra hole for the faceplate. So he was going to reject it because it was a quality control issue. But then as he's handling, he said, this guitar doesn't feel right. So he took the faceplate off and it was full of galleries. It wasn't a drill hole, that was an exit hole from a wood boring insect. The altered distribution of pathogens, vectors, and pests as a consequence of global trade in plants and plant products and packing materials should be of great concern. It will challenge our ability to meet the Millennium Development Goals. The good news, the world can produce enough food to feed 9 billion people. I'm confident of that. Bad news, we will remain challenged to get that food where it is needed, when it is needed. As most people who are immersed in this issue know, it's not just about being able to produce, it's about all the policies that affect where that food ends up. The better question is, can the world produce enough food where it is needed to feed 9 billion people? Verdict's out on it. Outlook, bad news. Competition for food and water will overtake competition for oil in both severity and significance in the next decade. So says the World Food Program. More bad news. Buying agricultural land and water rights as an investment based on predictions of future food needs. This is going on right now. It's amazing. This is a story from the Times in 2009 that Saudi investors, bankers, and agribusiness firms to spend billions of dollars to purchase land in Africa to solve Saudi food production shortfall. Kenya to lease nearly 100,000 acres to the Qatari government in return for financing a new port. They're so cash-strapped that they need to basically sell their future in order to deal with the present. South Korea to develop almost 400 square miles in Tanzania to produce food to export to South Korea. So if you look, you take the most food insecure region of the world, Africa, and we're buying the productive land to export out of that region of the world. Not sustainable. I went to a website, an investment company had the African Agricultural Land Fund. And I just wanted to give you an idea of how much money people are thinking they're going to make by investing in land in Africa. So, quote, purchasing and managing agricultural properties across the sub-Saharan region, crops, biofuels, livestock, game farming, and timber, returns projected in excess of 25% per annum. Interested investors are invited to contact the head of marketing, I left his name off. The minimum investment is 500,000 euros for individual investors and 5 million euros for institutional investors. That will give you an idea of how much money they think there is to be made by buying the land in Africa. So we go back again to our UN Millennium Development Goals. Let's eradicate hunger to alleviate poverty, eradicate poverty to alleviate hunger. The consequences, increases in standards of living lead to nonlinear increases in food consumption. We talked about that. Increases in standard of living lead to increases in energy consumption. Energy consumption is projected to triple in the next 20 years. Triple. And it makes sense. As economies emerge, they need more energy. Energy drives development. As long as food security is linked to trade, it will be subject to the uncertainties in the price of energy. We should look at trade to alleviate food insecurity not as the solution, but rather as a transition plan to food self-sufficiency for most nations. As incomes rise, the demand for food increases non-linearly. As the demand for food increases, the price of food increases. As the price of food increases, the number of people in poverty increases. Poverty increased 3% in 6 of the 8 countries monitored. We go back to this poverty cycle. This is really tough to break in some countries. So how do we solve the food security puzzle? Experts disagree, of course. Some say we need to double yields. Some say we need to double the acreage in production. Some say biotech is the solution. Some say we must rely on traditional agriculture. Some say trade. Some say self-sufficiency. So there's a lot of disagreement on how to achieve food security, but they all agree that the funding for the necessary research is wildly inadequate. Just not funding agriculture the way we used to. What's the data for that? I'll show you. As investment in agricultural research increases, the availability of food increases and the price of food decreases. Good thing. Bad news. As the availability of food increases and the price decreases, investment in agricultural research decreases. In 1980, 30% of World Bank funds went to agriculture. 2007, only 12% of World Bank funds went to agriculture because of what happened in 2008, all those riots. They changed it. In 2010, 18% of World Bank funds will go to agriculture, which is about $6 billion US. This may look like a big number, but when you consider the magnitude of this challenge, that's a small number. It's also further masked by the fact that the definition of agricultural research changed between 1980 and 2010. So now agricultural research also includes rural development, rural economic development. So the actual number of dollars going into the traditional sciences that support food production has still declined, even though the number looks like it's going up. Good news, as the price of food increases, investment in agricultural research increases. Bad news, since high food prices lead to increased poverty, high investment in agricultural research requires conditions that sustain poverty. How does this make any sense to me? So the paradox is this. Plant biosecurity is essential to food security, if for no other reason than just 4 plant species provide 59% of the calories that support humans. The solution to food insecurity is increased trade. So says FAO, G8, G20, the World Bank. But increased trade undermines plant biosecurity, so say all the plant biosecurity experts. How does this make any sense? The solution is the problem. But I don't want to leave you on too depressing. So whenever I need a lift, I go to the economic literature. And this is a quote, it's a modified quote, from the Kansas City Chamber of Commerce when they were doing a market analysis back in 2010 on what happened in '89. This is the language they came up with. What I want to do is I want to apply that to this food security challenge. The news was expected to be really bad. But in the end, it was just bad. And that's good, but not really good. We cannot predict the future, but we can prepare for it. We've got work to do. Thank you.